Zetetic Cosmogony. Conclusive evidence that the world is not a rotating, revolving globe, but a stationary plane circle. Preface to second edition. Since the first edition of this work, an unpretentious pamphlet of 48 pages, was published, so much interest in the subject has been manifested that a second edition is without doubt called for. In fact, long after the first edition was exhausted, letters from various parts of the world were received asking for copies which, to our regret, could not be supplied. In that pamphlet, very much of the evidence we had accumulated from various sources had to be omitted so as to reduce what otherwise would have been a bulky volume to a short treatise, retaining sufficient evidence to convince the minds of those who would take cognizance of and duly estimate proved facts of nature. Our labors have not been in vain. Many have been enabled to see through the delusions of modern astronomy. Letters from various parts testify that, in some cases, men and women have begun to make use of their brain power, which had been stunted and dwarfed by acceptation, without the slightest proof of the unscientific, unreasonable, unnatural, and infidel teachings of men foisted upon a credulous public in the name of science. Others, again, tell that the writers have thrown to the moles and to the bats the worldwide and almost universally believed hoax that we are living on a whirling sea-earth globe revolving faster than a cannonball travels, rushing through quote-unquote space at a rate beyond human power to conceive, and flying with the whole of the so-called solar system in another direction 20 times the speed of its rotation. To the editors of newspapers who, whether favorably or unfavorably, reviewed the pamphlet, our thanks are due, and now respectfully tendered. This edition is set forth with the assurance of the divine blessing and the firm conviction that truth is strong and must prevail. Introduction. It'll be noticed that the style of this volume differs considerably from the first edition. In that edition, we divided the book into 4 parts: scientific assertions, Bible statements, natural proofs, and application and conclusion. The first of these was covered by extracts from well-known astronomical works. The second was filled with Bible quotations, the direct opposite of the astronomical speculations. The third division contained many proofs of the impossibility of the truth of the globe theory, and the last division being made up of the logical arguments founded on the first 3. For convenience of reference, we have arranged the present edition alphabetically. In this way, any particular branch of the subject can be found without looking up the index, and something new is found on every page. Briefly, modern astronomical teaching affirms that the world we live on is a globe which rotates, revolves, and spins away in space at brain-reeling rates of speed, that the sun is 1.5 million times the size of the globe Earth and nearly 100 million miles distant from it, that the moon is about 1/4 of the size of the Earth, that it receives all its light from the sun and is thus only a reflector and not a giver of light, that it attracts the body of the earth and thus causes the tides, that the stars are worlds and suns, some of them equal in importance to our own sun himself, and others vastly his superior, that these worlds inhabited by sentient beings are without numbers and occupy space, boundless in extent and illimitable in duration, the whole of these interlaced bodies being subject to and supported by universal gravitation, the foundation and the father of the whole fabric. To fanciful minds and theoretical speculators, the so-called science of modern astronomy furnishes a field unsurpassed in any science for the unrestrained license of the imagination and the building up of a complicated conjuration of absurdities such as to overawe the simpleton and make him gape with wonder, to deceive even those who truly believe their assumptions to be facts, and to make men doubt divine revelation with as little discrimination as they were formerly called upon to believe. If the reader will carefully follow and weigh the evidence in the following chapters, he cannot fail to be delivered from the thraldom of popular credulity and led to seek the truth for himself. Current science declares that the earth was once shot off from the sun, a piece of molten rock which by universal attraction became larger, by indrafts from without, as the late R.A. Proctor assures us. This molten mass took 350 million years to cool down for protoplasm to get a footing, which took millions of years by evolution and selection to produce a Darwinian ape. Evolution and selection allied to and combined with the survival of the fittest again took many millions of years to evolve primeval man, many ages again elapsing before historical man was produced. There are 4 bodies, according to the late R.A. Proctor, which represent 4 stages of what we may term astronomical progression, as follows. 1. The moon was once inhabited, but is now a chaotic mass. 2. The earth is inhabited. It was once like the planet Jupiter. Earlier still, it was like the sun, and will become like the moon now is. 3. Jupiter was once like the sun. It is being prepared for inhabitants. When inhabited, it will be like the earth. When its race as an inhabited world has been run, it will become like the moon. The sun will become like Jupiter, and another sun will have taken its place. Later it will become like the earth, and will then be inhabited. Later still, it will become chaotic like the moon, and so on for countless ages, in fact, forever. What a grand conception! Yeah, rather, what a grand perversion of the reasoning powers, and what stultification of common sense! What an abuse of precious gifts in order to satisfy a fertile imagination, and supply idle curiosity with something new in the domain of science! No one who reads the Bible can but see how these unfounded speculations are diametrically opposed to its plain teaching. The science of the 19th century and the science of the Bible are totally at variance. If the one be true, the other is necessarily false. Which is it? Let the evidence here placed before the reader answer the question. Let honest-minded men and women who read these pages learn the truth for themselves by practical investigation into the facts herein set forth, which we challenge the whole scientific world to successfully dispute. We court no favor and fear no foe, scientific or otherwise. All we ask is careful attention and practical investigation. We have no fear as to the logical conclusion which shall be arrived at. Section 1. Assumptions. In order to account for natural phenomena in keeping with the assertions of the learned, many hypotheses have to be laid down, and many unfounded assumptions are absolutely necessary to support the unsound fabric of astronomical imagination. In Modern Science and Modern Thought by S. Lang, the following occurs on page 51. What is the material universe composed of? Ether, matter, and energy. Ether is not actually known to us by any test of which the senses can take cognizance, but it is a sort of mathematical substance which we are compelled to assume in order to account for the phenomenon of light and heat. Whatever explanation may be furnished regarding light and heat on this basis must be discarded as utterly untrustworthy because the premises are assumed. Once upon a time it was stated that, quote, the stars are motionless, but as soon as assumption was allowed to talk, the scene was changed, for, as Science Siftings informs us, volume 6, page 39, quote, as soon as it was conjectured that the stars were subject to the law of gravitation, it was inferred that they were not motionless, end quote. Professor Huxley had to resort to assumption to account for the disappearance of ships at sea, although, had he known the truth of the matter, or taken the trouble to inquire, his unwarranted assumptions would have been totally unnecessary. He says, quote, we assume the convexity of the water because we know of no other way to explain the appearance and disappearance of the ships at sea, end quote. What learning! What profound wisdom! If we, quote, know no other way, end quote, it is better to admit the fact and wait until we have found some other way out, to explain the difficulty, if there is any. Knowledge is gained by practical investigation and experience, and has no need of the assistance of assumption to provide an excuse for ignorance. If water could be proved to be convex, there would be no need to assume it to be so. We should have many proofs and abundant evidence of the fact. but the fact that water has been proved to be level hundreds of times makes it necessary for those who refuse to believe proved facts which tell against their theory to resort to assumption to maintain their unreasoning position. And yet, this same professor, in his book Science and Culture, says, quote, "The assertion which outstrips evidence is not only a blunder but a crime." End quote. The assertion, therefore, that water is convex against proof furnished many times over that it is level is not only a blunder, but a crime. Age of the Earth. This is a subject which has been much speculated upon. I shall quote a few of the more prominent assumptions. Sir Robert Ball, in his Story of the Heavens, pages 169 and 170, tells us that, quote, "We cannot pretend to know how many thousands of millions of years ago this epoch was, but we may be sure that earlier still the earth was even hotter, until at length we seem to see the temperature increase to a red heat. From a red heat we look back to a still earlier age when the earth was white hot, back again till we find the surface of our now solid globe was actually molten." End quote. But imagination goes still further than this. In, quote, "In Our Place Among Infinities" by R.A. Proctor, pages 9 and 10, we find the following, quote, "Let it suffice that we recognize as one of the earliest stages of our Earth's history her condition as a rotating mass of glowing vapor, capturing then as now, but far more actively then than now, masses of matter which approached near enough, and growing by these continual indrafts from without." End quote. How we are to recognize that the earth was once a rotating mass of vapor, we are not told. On what evidence the recognition rests is not stated. Perhaps it is not too much to assume that this is like most other assumptions of the astronomical schools, without the slightest vestige of possibility, to say nothing of probability. Sir R. Ball tells us that, quote, "We may be sure that the earth was once, quote, actually molten, but on what provable data the surety of this actuality rests we are left to the foggy mazes of imagination to discover. But imagination assisted by assumption will account for anything, and so we are told that it took 350 million years for the earth to cool down from a temperature of 2000 centigrade down to 200. Proctor says that Bischoff has shown this, and so we ought to be sure enough. Were similar ridiculous statements made in relation to any other science than astronomy or geology? I believe the general reader would dismiss them at sight. But because they are made in a domain of science, where the general reader in most cases cannot follow, they are allowed to pass as the genuine product of learning and investigation. Here as they are at best but wild and utterly impossible theories. In Modern Science and Modern Thought, page 44, we're informed that, quote, "It is right, however, to state that all mathematical calculations of the time based on the assumed rate at which cosmic matter cools into suns and planets, and these into solid and habitable globes, are in the highest degree of uncertain." End quote. Thus, after all the labor to establish a theory, allied with much skill in setting it forth, in its best dress, we are calmly assured that all these tall figures and imaginations are based on premises which are in the highest degree uncertain. If evidence for rejecting these fanciful hypotheses summarily and in toto were wanting, surely it is now furnished to satisfaction. Not only are these mathematical calculations of assumed premises, quote, "in the highest degree uncertain," but they are to be classed with the tomfooleries of the age, and reckoned among the many and impossible absurdities of the present day. One of the chief of recent speculations regarding the earth is that it is a body like the planets, because it has been shown that the sun and the stars are of the same constituent parts as the earth. Iron, salt, etc., are said to be elements of the sun's composition, and as the earth contains these and other minerals, it is a globe or planet like any heavenly bodies which contains the same metals. What is known as spectrum analysis is relied upon as proving this. A prism is placed in position so as to intercept the sun's rays, and the colors seen through this instrument, red, orange, yellow, blue, are said to be the result of various metals contained in the sun in a state of fusion, emitting their several colors in the combined sunlight, which total light is decomposed into its component colors by the prism. With the object of testing the conclusions arrived at by the learned relative to spectrum analysis, several experiments were made by the writer. The light of the sun on a clear day about noon, seen through the prism, disclosed the various colors that can be seen through this instrument. On a hazy day before sunset, the colors seen were the same but very faint. Light from a lighthouse and a star seen through the prism showed the colors to be the same, the color from the light of the star being much less brilliant than from that of the lighthouse. Light from a paraffin street lamp gave the same result as light from a star or the sun, only much fainter. Then the electric light was tried. A large street lamp of great power and several others of less power gave the same result as the sun, the star, the lighthouse, and the street lamp, but in various degrees of brilliancy according to the power of the light. Even a candle gave a very faint yellow-blue tinge, so slight that it had to be looked at for some time before anything but blue was apparent. If therefore it be argued that spectrum analysis proves that the sun is made of the same metals as we find in the earth, and that therefore the earth is a product of evolution, then it is equally clear that the electric light and the glass shade of the lamp which encases it are really composed of iron and various other metals in a state of fusion, constituting indeed a globe of glowing vapor, and not glass, carbon, etc. at all. It is also reasonable to conclude that the paraffin lamp and the candle are composed of metals in a state of fusion, and that there is in reality no paraffin, no glass, no tallow, and no wick. That is to say, known facts must be thrown aside, common sense stultified, and reason dethroned in order to bolster up the unprovable assumptions of modern science relative to the doctrine of evolution as applied to the earth and the heavenly bodies. Aeronautics. If the world be a ball, as Sir R. Ball gravely informs us, the aeronaut should be one of his most ardent supporters, as the highest part of the surface of the globe would be directly under the car of a balloon, and the edges would fall away or dip down in every direction. The universal testimony of aeronauts, however, is entirely against the globular assumption, as the following quotations show. The London Journal of 18th July 1857 says, quote, "The chief peculiarity of the view from a balloon at a considerable elevation was the altitude of the horizon, which remained practically on a level with the eye at an elevation of 2 miles, causing the surface of the earth to appear concave instead of convex, and to recede during the rapid ascent, whilst the horizon in the balloon seemed to be stationary." End quote. J. Glacier, F.R.S., in his work Travels in the Air, states, quote, "On looking over the top of the car, the horizon appeared to be on a level with the eye, and taking a grand view of the whole visible area beneath, I was struck with its great regularity. All was dwarfed to one plane. It seemed too flat, too even, apparently artificial." In his accounts of his ascents in the air, M. Camilla Flammarion says, quote, "The earth appeared as one immense plain, richly decorated with ever-varied colors. Hills and valleys are all passed over without being able to distinguish any undulation in the immense plain." Mr. Elliot, an American aeronaut, says, quote, "I don't know that I ever hinted heretofore that the aeronaut may well be the most skeptical man about the rotundity of the earth. Philosophy forces the truth upon us, but the view of the earth from the elevation of a balloon is that of an immense terrestrial basin, the deeper part of which is directly under one's feet." From Zetetic Astronomy, page 37. In March 1897 I met M. Victor Emmanuel, and asked him to give me an idea of the shape of the earth as seen from a balloon. He informed me that instead of the earth declining from the view on either side, and the higher part being under the car, as is popularly supposed, it was the exact opposite, the lowest part, like a huge basin, being immediately under the car, and the horizon on all sides rising to the level of the eye. This, he admitted, was exactly what should be the appearance of a plane viewed from a balloon. It is almost needless to say that a globe would present a totally different appearance, the highest part being directly under the car. Contrasts. If the Earth be the globe of popular belief, the same amount of heat and cold, summer and winter, should be experienced at the same latitudes north and south of the equator. The same number of plants and animals would be found, and the same general conditions exist. That the very opposite is the case disproves the globular assumption. The great contrasts between places at the same latitudes north and south of the equator is a strong argument against the received doctrine of the rotundity of the Earth. From the Geological Journal for November 1893, I extract the following. Quote, "A Voyage Towards the Antarctic Sea," report by W.S. Bruce. Quote, "On January 12, 1893, we saw what appeared to be high mountainous land and glaciers stretching from about 64 degrees west to about 65 degrees south, 58 degrees west. This, I believe, may have been the eastern coast of Graham's Land, which has never before been seen. But it would be unwise to be too certain, for it must have been 60 miles distant." End quote. Meteorology. Periods of fine calm weather alternate with very severe gales, usually accompanied by fog and snow. The barometer never attained 30 inches. The records of air temperature are very remarkable. Our lowest temperature was 20.8 degrees Fahrenheit, our highest 37.6, only a difference of 16.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the total range for a period extending slightly over 2 months. Compare this with our climate, where in a single day and night you may get a variation of more than twice that amount. The average temperatures show a still more remarkable uniformity. December averaged 31.14 degrees Fahrenheit for 115 readings. January 31.1 degrees Fahrenheit for 198 readings. February 29.6 for 116, a range of less than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. This I consider to be very significant and worthy of special attention by future Antarctic explorers, for may it not indicate a similar uniformity of temperature throughout the year? Antarctic cold has been much dreaded by some. The 429 readings I took during December, January, and February show an average temperature of only 30.76 degrees Fahrenheit, this being in the very heat of summer in latitudes corresponding to the Faroe Islands in the north, but I believe the temperatures of winter will not vary very much from that of summer. This uniformity of temperature partly accounts for the great accumulation of ice, which is formed not on account of the great severity of the winter, but because there is practically no summer to melt it. Quote, "Mr. Seebohm has vividly pictured the onrush of summer in the Arctic, but how different in the Antarctic. There is eternal winter, and snow never melts. As far north as a man has traveled, he has found reindeer and hare basking in the sun, and country brilliant with rich flora. Within the Antarctic Circle, no plant is to be found whatsoever." End quote. Report by C.W. Donald, M.B., C.M. Quote, "On the passage out, we on board Achieve touched at the beautiful island of Madeira in October, and 2 more months landed us in the barren Falkland Islands. Sailing thence on December 11th, we crossed the stormy waters to the east of Cape Horn, and saw our first iceberg on December 18th. On the same day, we sighted Clarence Island, one of the South Shetlands. These are called after our own northern Shetlands, and the part sighted by us lies only some 60 miles nearer the pole. But what a difference between the two places! Our own Shetlands bright with ladies' dresses and the light summer garments, and carrying tennis rackets and parasols; the South Shetlands, even in the height of summer, clad in an almost complete covering of snow, only a steep cliff or bold rock standing out in deep contrast here and there, the only inhabitants being birds or seals, and even the bird life, with the exception of the penguins, is scanty. Sir James Ross, on his 3rd voyage, entered the ice at nearly the same spot, and 50 years before, all but a week, had sheltered from a westerly gale under the inhospitable shores of Clarence Island. Its highest point stands 4,557 feet above sea level." End quote. The following from Polar Explorations, read before the Royal Dublin Society, is taken from Zetetic Astronomy by Parallax. Quote, on the South Georgias, in the same latitude as Yorkshire in the north, Cook did not find a shrub big enough to make a toothpick. Captain Cook describes it as, quote, savage and horrible. The wild rocks raised their lofty summits till they were lost in the clouds, and the valleys lay covered with everlasting snow. Not a tree was to be seen, not a shrub even big enough to make a toothpick. Who could have thought that an island of no greater extent than this, the Isle of Georgia, situated between the latitude of 54 and 55 degrees, should, in the very heat of summer, be in a manner wholly covered many fathoms deep with frozen snow? The lands which lie to the south are doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, whose horrible and savage aspect I have not words to describe. The South Shetlands, occupying a corresponding latitude to their namesakes in the north, present scarcely a vestige of vegetation. Kerguelen, as low as latitude as 50 degrees south, boasts 13 species of plants, of which only one, a peculiar kind of cabbage, has been found useful in cases of scurvy, while Iceland, 15 degrees nearer to the pole in the north, boasts 870 species. Even marine life is sparse in certain tracts of vast extent, and the seabird is seldom observed flying over such wastes. The contrast between the limits of organic life in the Arctic and Antarctic zones is very remarkable and significant. Vegetables and land animals are found at nearly 80 degrees in the north, while from the parallel of 58 degrees in the south, the lichen and such like plants only clothe the rocks, and seabirds and the cetaceous tribes alone are seen upon the desolate beaches. McClintock describes herds of reindeer, a perfect forest of antlers, moving north in the summer, the elder duck and the brent goose through the air, the unwieldy family of the cetacea through the waters, the Arctic bear upon the ice, the musk ox and reindeer along the land, all wend their way northward at certain seasons. Now these indications are absent from the southern zone, as is also the inhabitation of man. The bones of musk oxen killed by the Esquimau Indians were found north of the 79th parallel, while in the south, man is not found above the 56th parallel of latitude. End quote. This is supported by the following from the Western Christian Advocate of 10th February 1897, copied from Appleton's Science Monthly. Quote, the distinctiveness of the Antarctic climate as compared with the Arctic is found in the relations of both the summer and the winter temperatures. The high summer heat of the north, which in the few months of its existence has the energy to develop that lovely carpeting of grass and flowers which gives to the low-lying lands, even to the 82nd parallel of latitude, a charm equal to that of the upland meadows of Switzerland, is in a measure wanting in the south. In its place, frequent cold and dreary fogs navigate the atmosphere, and render dreary and desolate a region that extends far into what may be properly designated the habitable zone. The fields of anemones, poppies, sassafrases, and mountain pinks, of dwarf birches and willows are replaced by interminable snow and ice, with only here and there bare patches of rock, to give assurance that something underlies the snow covering. Man's habitations in the northern hemisphere extend to the 78th parallel of latitude, and formerly extend to the 82nd. In the southern hemisphere, they find their limit in Fuegia, in the 55th parallel, fully 350 miles nearer the equator than where, as in the Shetland Islands, ladies in lawn dresses disport in the game of tennis, and still 700 miles further from the equator in Siberia, Nordenskjold found forests of pine rising with trunks 70 to 100 feet in height. In the Voyage of a Naturalist by C. Darwin, pages 210 and 212, we're informed that, quote, one side of the harbor is formed by a hill about 1,500 feet high, which Captain Fitzroy has called after Sir J. Banks in commemoration of his disastrous excursion, which proved fatal to 2 men of his party, and nearly so to Dr. Solander. The snowstorm which was the cause of this misfortune happened in the middle of January, corresponding to our July in the latitude of Durham. We were detained here several days by bad weather. The climate was certainly wretched. The summer solstice is now 25th December past, yet every day snow fell on the hills, and in the valleys there was rain accompanied by sleet. It is utterly impossible to shut one's eyes to the fact that these evidences furnish indisputable proof that the figure of the earth cannot be globular. If it were of that shape, the same conditions would be found at equal latitudes north and south, which we have seen is simply not the case. Contradictions. The grave contradictions that exist among the recognized teachers of astronomical science ought to cause a thinking man to pause before accepting a theory about which no two of its exponents may be found to agree. Sir Isaac Newton, in his Principia, resuscitated the fundamental proposition of Pythagoras thus, quote, "The sun is the center of the solar system and immovable." Since then, Professor Herschel discovered that the sun was not immovable. In regard to the atmosphere of the planet Mars, the same contradiction is manifest. In the Christian Million, San Jose, 9th August, 1894, we find that, quote, "Mr. Norman Locklear has been telling an interviewer that Mars is like us in many respects. It has an atmosphere like ours." The Standard of 18th August 1894 says, quote, "Professor Campbell of the Lick Observatory announces that he has demonstrated that Mars presents no evidence of having an atmosphere." Then Mr. J. Gillespie, in his Triumph of Philosophy, page 89, comes to the rescue and says, quote, "As to the planets being inhabited, if we take refraction into account, we shall find that there is not such a thing as atmosphere near them. For instance, in an eclipse of the moon, especially at her apogee, the earth is brought to a mere point by refraction, caused by the air of the earth, and, were the moon a little further away from this point, it would be brought to nothingness. That is, although the earth were exactly in a straight line between the sun and the moon, the earth would not even show a spot on the moon's disk. Now, by this same rule, if either Mercury or Venus had any atmosphere, they could never be seen crossing the sun's disk. I think this is satisfactory proof that they have no atmosphere, and cannot, therefore, be inhabited." End quote. After all this delightful uncertainty, a writer in Knowledge of February 1895 says, quote, "The interesting chapter on solar theories is well fitted to serve as a lesson in modesty. So diverse and conflicting are the various hypotheses, so difficult to harmonize are the observed facts." End quote. When we come to consider the atmosphere that concerns us most, the same contradictions are evident. Sir David Brewster, in his More Worlds Than One, tells us that the atmosphere of the earth extends for about 45 miles. In Science Siftings of 18th March, 1893, the following occurs. Quote, "We may infer that a few hundred miles embrace all the gaseous envelope of the globe." And in Elementary Physiography, page 293, we are told that, quote, "The height of the atmosphere is not known with any certainty. There is probably no fixed limit to the atmosphere." End quote. It is a fair inference from these contradictory statements that present-day scientists, so-called, do not know anything about the height of the Earth's atmosphere. Many men of thought and learning have scouted the ideas imposed upon us by Sir Isaac Newton, of which the following is a sample. Quote, "The repetition of a blunder is impertinent and ridiculous. To liberate oneself from an error is difficult, sometimes indeed impossible for even the strongest and most gifted minds. But to take up the error of another, and persist in it with stiff-necked obstinacy, is a proof of poor qualities. The obstinacy of a man of originality when he errs may make us angry, but the stupidity of the copyist irritates and renders us miserable. And if, in our strife with Sir Isaac Newton, we have sometimes passed the bounds of moderation, the whole blame is to be laid upon the school of which Newton was the head, whose incompetence is proportional to its arrogance, whose laziness is proportional to its self-sufficiency, and whose virulence and love of persecution hold each other in perfect equilibrium. Quote, through the whole of Newton's experiments there runs a display of pedantic accuracy, but how the matter really stands with Newton's gift of observation and with his experimental aptitudes, every man possessing eyes and senses may make himself aware. It may be boldly asked, where can the man be found possessing the extraordinary gifts of Newton, who would suffer himself to be deluded by such a hocus-pocus if he had not in the first instance wilfully deceived himself? Only those who know the strength of self-deception and the extent to which it sometimes trenches on dishonesty are in a condition to explain the conduct of Newton and of Newton's school. To support his unnatural theory, Newton heaps fiction upon fiction, seeking to dazzle when he could not convince. End quote. Goethe, Proceedings of the Royal Institution of Great Britain, Volume 4, Part 3, page 353 through 355. Dr. W. Friend says, quote, it has over and over again been the hope and expectation of intelligent and unprejudiced men that some less extravagant and more intelligible system would sooner or later be found as a substitute for the mathematical romance with which Newton has favored the world. His name has been the sanction for a device which, the more it is examined, excites the more astonishment as its adoption by men of research and observation. End quote. Then again, Kepler's laws, said to be so well established and so absolutely necessary to the truth of the Newtonian hypothesis, when weighed in the balance by competent judges, are contradicted and set aside by a stroke of the pen. Professor W. B. Carpenter, in the Modern Review, October 1880, says, quote, it was not until 12 years after the publication of his first two laws that Kepler was able to announce the discovery of the third. This, again, was the outcome of a long series of guesses, and what was remarkable as to the error of the idea which suggested the second law to his mind was still more remarkable as to the third, for not only in his search for the harmony of which he felt assured did he proceed on the erroneous notion of a whirling force emanating from the sun, which decreases with increase of distance, but he took as his guide another assumption no less erroneous, that the masses of the planets increase with their distance from the sun. In order to make the last fit with the facts, he was driven to assume a relation of their respective densities, which we now know to be utterly untrue, for, as he himself says, unless we assume this proportion of the densities, the law of the periodic times will not answer. Thus, says his biographer, 3 out of the 4 suppositions made by Kepler to explain the beautiful law he had detected are now indisputably known to be false, what he considered to be proof of it being only a mode of false reasoning, by which any required result might be deduced from any given principles. End quote. Newton's theory and Kepler's laws are the chief foundational stones of modern astronomy, and when these are shaken, the whole fabric reels and staggers like a drunken man, until, sooner or later, it will find a grave in the oblivion that it so well merits. The Daily Chronicle of the 8th of April, 1891, says, quote, it may be a surprise to find that we are still imperfectly acquainted with the figure of the earth. End quote. The Ceylon Independent of 23rd December 1893 has the following. Quote, this question seems to be still agitating the Austrian government, and more than one Austrian man of war that has called here lately has had an officer on board whose special commission was to make observations for the purpose of ascertaining the attraction of the earth in order thereby to arrive at the exact shape of the globe. An officer thus employed is on the Austrian steamer Fasana, who, since the vessel's arrival, has spent a good deal of time at the National Bank, where a room was allotted him for the purpose of adjusting his instruments. An officer engaged on similar duty was on the Kaiserin Elizabeth the other day. End quote. Von Gumpack, in his work Figure of the Earth, tells us how men of science made the world a globe. Quote, the early of the Newtonian theory is the mere creation of the fantasy. Its shape has been determined partly of imaginary and partly of positively erroneous elements. and results of subsequent experiments and measurements have, by means of purely mathematical factors and tentative formulas, been adapted to its presupposed figure." End quote. Mr. J. Gillespie, who believes that the Earth is a globe, suspended in space, with no revolution around the sun, says, in his Triumph of Philosophy, page 6, quote, "I can challenge any astronomer in Great Britain on any point in theoretical astronomy, and prove that the present theory is a regular burlesque, a hoax, and a swindle. If it is a sin to tell a lie, what must be the doom of men who teach generation after generation one of the most glaring and degraded falsehoods ever laid before mankind?" End quote. Dr. Lardner, in his Museum of Science, says, quote, "All the diurnal changes of appearance presented by the firmament, the risings and settings of the sun, moon, and stars, and their varying appearances in different latitudes, admit of being explained with equal precision and completeness, either by supposing the universe to revolve daily around the earth, or the earth to revolve daily on its axis." End quote. Then, as to the velocity of light, if light travels at all, the same glorious mixture and uncertainty again present themselves. Guillemin, in the Heavens, conjectures that light travels at the rate of 192,000 miles a second. M. Leon Foucault guesses 184,000 miles, and Sir R. Ball 180,000. The editor of Science Siftings assumes first time 186,000 miles an hour, the second time 196. This is all contradicted by a writer in the English Mechanic of 27th of July, 1894, who says, quote, "I believe no one now holds the view that light actually moves." End quote. Most people think that there is only one school of astronomy in vogue, whereas there are at least four, all at loggerheads with each other. One, the Ptolemaists, represented by J. Gillespie of Dumfries, who suppose the earth globe a center for the revolution of the sun, moon, and stars. 2. The Koreshians of America, who suppose the earth a hollow globe for us to live inside. 3. The Newtonian Copernicans, who suppose the sun a center, keeping the planets whirling in its orbits by gravity. And 4. The Cartesian Copernicans, who suppose the planets to whirl round the sun without necessity of gravity, Sir R. Phillips heading up this school. Astronomy will sometimes summon geology to its aid when difficult problems are awaiting solution, but astronomers generally claim that when the two sciences disagree, astronomy is the safest assumption. S. Lang, however, in his Modern Science and Modern Thought, claims superiority for geology. On pages 48 and 49, he says, quote, "The conclusions of geology, at any rate up to the Silurian period, are approximate facts and not theories, while the astronomical conclusions are theories based on data so uncertain that while in some cases they give results in incredibly short, like that of 15 million years for the whole past process of the formation of the solar system, and in others they give results almost incredibly long, as in that which supposes the moon to have been thrown off when the earth was rotating in 3 hours. The safest course in the present state of our knowledge seems to be to assume that geology really proves the duration of the present order of things to have been somewhere over 100 million years." End quote. Thus, one fable falsely called science exposes another fable of about the same value. The safest course in the present state, as he said, of the utter ignorance of science as to the matter here in dispute is certainly to reject both these delusions and seek the truth for ourselves. Geological blunders have been many and frequent, but they are seldom allowed to reach the eyes or ears of those who are duped into believing all this imposing science teaches. The Daily Chronicle of 14th January 1893 speaks pretty plain and proves the truth of the above remarks. The paper says, quote, "A geological blunder. There is in Nature an article by a French writer on Sir Archibald Galkey, Director General of the Geological Survey, which is just now causing a good deal of talk amongst English men of science. Of course, nobody is surprised at the fulsomeness of M. de Laparent's eulogy. as nature seems to exist for pushing the great official scientific syndicate of Huxley, Hooker, Geikie, and Co., Limited, very strictly limited, which may be said to run science in England. M.D. LaParent would probably not have been permitted to write anything about a member of it unless it was fulsome. What has really amazed people is the audacity with which a famous historic bungle on the part of Geological Survey is glossed over, and the Director General not only credited with the work of those who exposed and corrected it, to his utter discomfiture, but actually covered with laurels for thus winning one of the most glorious scientific conquests of the century. This whole thing is delightfully characteristic of state-endowed science in England. If you are one of the official syndicate who run it, you may blunder with impunity and make your country ridiculous at the taxpayer's expense. Scientific men who can correct you shrink from the task. They know that the syndicate can boycott them and by intrigue keep them out of every honor and profit, and that the syndicate's satellites can write and shout down everywhere independent, non-official critics. They also know that if, perchance, some particular intrepid person does succeed in exposing one of the syndicate, they can always, by the same means, after the public has forgotten the incident, suppress him and boldly appropriate to themselves the credit of his work. The geological secret of the Highlands, with the unlocking of which Sir Archibald Gelkie is now credited, was really made a puzzle for more than a half-century by the blundering of the Geographical Survey and Director General Sir Roderick Murchison, and famous courtier and society geologist of the last generation. In the Highlands we saw gneisses and ordinary crystalline schists resting on Silurian strata, and he foolishly held the sequence to be quite normal. The schists, he would have it, were not archaic formations, but only metamorphosed Silurian deposits. He also held the primitive gneiss was not part of the molten crust of the globe, but only sediments of sand and mud altered by intense pressure and heat. Murchison, not to put too fine a point on it, bounced everybody into accepting this absurd theory, and the whole forces of the Geological Survey, with its official and social influence, together with the unscrupulous power of the official syndicate, which then, as now, jobbed science wherever it had a state endowment, were spent in perpetuating the blunder and blasting the scientific reputation of whoever scoffed at it. But in the Natural History School of Aberdeen University it was scoffed at. The late Dr. Nicol, professor of natural history in Aberdeen, proved that Murchison and the survey were wholly wrong, his proof being as complete as the existing state of science allowed. When he died, Dr. Aileen Nicholson took the same side, and for years, in relation to this grand problem, it was Aberdeen University against the world. In shouting the last word, no voice has been louder than Sir Archibald Gelkie. It is therefore diverting to find his official biographer stating in Nature that all the time he was wrestling in foro conscientia with doubts as to the soundness of the official position, and that finally his love of truth prompted him to order a resurvey of the whole Highland region. In plain English, the taxpayer, having had to pay for Murchison's bungling survey, was, because of his successor's love of the truth, to enjoy the luxury of paying over again to correct it." End quote. The real truth, however, is this. When it was supposed that the Aberdonians were finally crushed, there arose in England a young geologist called Lapworth, who had the courage to revise the whole controversy and take sides with the Aberdeen school. As he developed an extraordinary genius for stratigraphy, he not only broke into pieces the official work of the Geological Survey in the Highlands, but by revealing the true secret of the structure of that perplexing region, he played havoc on the Murchisons and the Gelkies and all their satellites, convicting them of bungling and covering them with ridicule. Nature, in fact, in these parts had suffered from a much more powerful emetic than Murchison imagined, and when bits of the primitive crust of the globe were thrown up and pushed on the top of more recent deposits, Murchison jumped to the conclusion that they were of later date than what they lay on top of. It was a terrible blunder, as the Aberdeen men persistently held, and we do not wonder that Sir Archibald Gelkie, who rose to place and power by defending it, is anxious to have his connection with it veiled by a friendly hand. But it is rather outrageous for their friendly hand to give him the credit of conceding the very error which he defended to the last gasp, and deprive Professor Lapworth of the honor of having banished it from science. One of the most diverting things, however, in the article in Nature is that Sir Archibald Gelkie is belauded because, when frightened by the stir Professor Lapworth's paper, made in 1883, he was fain to send his surveyors to go over to the Highlands again. He, as their official chief, ordered them to divest themselves of any presupposition in favor of published views, and to map out the actual facts. Old Colin Campbell, when he objected to the institution of Victoria Cross, said it was as absurd to decorate a soldier for being brave as a woman for being virtuous. He did not foresee a still greater absurdity, that of eulogizing a man of science because he instructed his assistants to tell the truth when conducting an investigation into his own blunders. From the Daily Chronicle, Saturday, January 14th, 1893. And in a further issue, the same paper says, quote, Sir Archibald Gelkie, Director General of the Geological Survey, has at last taken notice in Nature. We need hardly say of our article condemning the attempt to give the survey all the credit of some of the most remarkable discoveries of the age, which have really been made by men unaided by the state, and toiling for daily bread as teachers of science. We had heard something that caused us to expose this scandal. The fact is, the official ring of state-endowed science, not content with jobbing the Royal Society and its distinctions, as their critics have been showing in the Times, are meditating a raid upon the taxpayer. They want more money, and as a preliminary step, their official organ, Nature, of course, begins to boom their work and reputations. This is a good old game. The only novelty in the situation is that a daily newspaper, for the first time in history, ventured to show it up. We do not desire to be harsh to the illustrious scientists who edit Nature. It is the duty of all official organs to make big men out of small material. But when they begin to do this by coolly confiscating the achievements of private and independent workers for one of the managing partners of the great firm of Huxley, Gelkie, Dyer and Company, Limited, we thought it time to protest. The letters that have been appearing in the Times make some funny revelations about the way the Royal Society is worked. Sir Archibald Gelkie's defense suggests that if the Times only followed up the game it scented, it would show its readers plenty of sport. We ourselves would make no objection to a vote of money in aid of researchers into the frank and practical manner and the terms on which the official gang of science frequently acknowledge the achievements of young outsiders. End quote. Daily Chronicle, February 2nd, 1893. Modern astronomy has been set down as the most exact of all sciences, and geology said to be little less than infallible. The reader may form his own conclusions from the above extracts. End section 1, Zetetic Cosmogony.